Welcome to Mr. Chalk's Revision Tips. In this video, we will look at theories of evolution, natural selection, and fossils. So, the first person who really explained how evolution happens was Charles Darwin in his theory of natural selection. So, we'll look at Darwin in more detail, the work that Wallace contributed to natural selection and the theories of evolution, and how Lamarck had a slightly different view. So, Alfred Russel Wallace was a great admirer of Darwin and a fellow naturalist who independently proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection. Wallace produced scientific journals with Darwin in 1858, which prompted Darwin to publish on the origin of species the following year. So, after a variety of zoological discoveries, Wallace proposed the theory of evolution, which matched Darwin's unpublished ideas that he'd kept secret for nearly 20 years. Darwin emphasised completion and competition between individuals of the same species to survive and reproduce, whereas Wallace emphasised environmental pressures on varieties and species, forcing them to adapt to their local conditions, leading populations in different locations to diverge. At the beginning of the 19th century, Lamarck was a French scientist who developed an alternative theory of evolution to that of Darwin's. So Lamarck's theory involved two key ideas. So a characteristic which is being used more and more by an organism will become bigger and stronger, and one that is not used will eventually disappear. Any feature of an organism that is improved through the use is then passed on to its offspring. So, Lamarck's theory cannot account for all of the observations made about life on Earth. So, for instance, his theory implies that all organisms would gradually become more complex and simple organisms would disappear. And we know that that is not the case. Lamarck's theory suggested that giraffe's original short-necked ancestor repeatedly stretched its neck to reach the high branches to eat. So Lamarck believed that the stretching elongated the giraffe's neck, which became a useful characteristic that was passed on to future generations. So this resulted in the length of the giraffe's neck increasing over time. So if we look at this question, so Philomena lived about 35 million years ago. Both Philomena and African elephants reach up into trees to get leaves. Lamarck's theory is different from Darwin's theory, so use Lamarck's theory to explain how the elephant trunk evolved. So if you pause the video, then have a think. So the way that we would answer this is the ancestor stretched its nose during its lifetime to reach the leaves, and this would gradually be passed on to its offspring. In the 1800s, many scientists could not decide whether Lamarck's theory or Darwin's theory was right. Give two reasons why. So just have a think about it. So some of the reasons that you might have given is that there is insufficient evidence, the mechanisms for inheritance were not known, and genes and DNA had not been discovered. So before the 1800s, many people had different ideas to explain where all living things on Earth had come from. So what idea was this? So the main belief that people had was that God had made all living things, or you might want to go and mention creationism. So Charles Darwin was an English naturalist who studied variation in plants, animals and fossils during a 5-year voyage around the world in the 19th century. Darwin visited 4 continents on the HMS Beagle and proposed that individual organisms within a particular species show a wide range of variation of characteristics. Individuals with characteristics most suited to the environment are more likely to survive and breed successfully, and the characteristics that have enabled these individuals to survive are then passed on to the next generation. So Darwin's ideas were documented in the book called The Origin of Species in 1859. So the theory of evolution through the process of natural selection was only gradually accepted. So some of the reasons why is that the theory challenged the idea that God had made all living organisms. There was insufficient evidence at the time, and the mechanism for the inheritance and variation was not known until 50 years after the theory was published. So if we look at this question, Darwin was one of the first scientists to state that humans and other primates had common ancestors. Many people were against Darwin's ideas at the time. Give 2 reasons why. So you could have something like they might have had religious objections, there was insufficient evidence, therefore it could not be proved, and the mechanism for heredity was not known. Natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. It is the key mechanism of evolution, so the change in the heritable traits characteristics over a population of generations changes over time. So individuals within a species show a wide range of variation. This variation is because of different genes. Individuals with characteristics most suited to the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. The genes that allow these individuals to successfully survive are then passed on to their offspring. So individuals that are poorly adapted to their environment are less likely to survive and reproduce. This means that their genes are less likely to be passed on to the next generation. So if we look at describing the process of natural selection, so just have a quick think about how you do that. So some of the key things that you would need to include is that there is variation. This variation is in the genes and might be caused by mutations. So better adapted organisms survive, and those organisms that survive can reproduce and pass on those genes to their offspring. So there are many different species of bird on Earth today. Describe how these species might have evolved. So if you're answering that question, you'll need to talk maybe something about separation of a species into 2 areas, different environmental conditions, which meant that mutations could occur or genetic variation would occur within each population. The ones that were better adapted survive, or natural selection occurs, so therefore favourable alleles or genes are passed on to the next population, and eventually different populations are no longer able to breed successfully with each other because they have become different species. Fossils are formed in a number of ways, but most are formed when a plant or animal dies in a watery environment and is buried in mud and silt. Soft tissues quickly decompose, leaving hard bones or shells behind. So over time, the sediment builds up over the top and hardens into rock. So if we're looking at the process, first thing that we need to talk about is that everything apart from the bones rapidly decays. So the bones are left over and get covered in sediment. Layers of sediment eventually build up, forming sedimentary rock. Other minerals will go and replace the minerals in the bones in a process called mineralization. So the bones are eventually turned into stone and become fossils. And eventually these fossils can be dug up over time. So if we think about, scientists have found very few fossils of the earliest life forms. Give one reason why. You might talk about they were all soft bodies, so therefore decomposed. They lacked hard parts, so no skeletons or shells. They could have been eaten, decayed, or the fossils could have been destroyed. So if we look at suggesting how the fossil in the photograph to the side was formed, some of the key things that you need to talk about is that the fish dies and is buried in sand or mud. The soft parts decay, leaving the bones behind, and eventually mineralization would occur. So the species of fish shown in the photograph to the side is now extinct. Give two possible causes of extinction. There is a wide range of things that you could include. You could talk about droughts, ice ages, global warming, volcanic activity. There's a full list in the yellow box below. Thanks for watching.